Most people would say, I think there's something that's good, I think there's some things that are evil. Where do you think that idea came from?
I think the idea pretty much came from the social norms and what's expected of you in society.
Do you believe there's such a thing as like good and evil?
For sure, yeah. I'm actually pretty religious, so there's definitely something natural about, what feels good. So I feel like that comes from God, and evil would come from Satan.
We all see different kinds of good and evil in the world. How does the book of Genesis explain where all that came from?
It actually is the only way of even making sense of words like good and evil.
Dr. Jason Lyle, a Christian astrophysicist, he's well acquainted with the explanatory nature of the book of Genesis.
Because you see, in the secular worldview, they can't really account for the existence of good or evil or even define those terms.
I would define good as anything that really makes you happy and then maybe also doesn't have a negative consequence on other people.
I don't think there's necessarily a right or wrong. I think it's mainly your perspective of what's good or evil.
In Genesis, we're to understand that what good is what God does, what He approves of, what He commends. And evil is that which God disapproves of, that which incurs His wrath. But in the secular worldview, good and evil are reduced to mere preferences. So I like that or I don't like that. That's all you can say, but you can't say anything is objectively good or evil in a secular worldview. So only Genesis gives us a meaningful definition of good and evil and explains how evil came into a world that was originally good.
The stuff we call evil today, things like rape or murder, most people say that's evil, right? Those could be advantageous for some people from an evolutionary standpoint. Why do you think the society decided like that was bad then?
I mean, I see how, it can be advantageous, but at the same time, if you're hurting someone, I think that's when you start to consider it to be evil. And also religion has a lot to do with a lot of what's determined to be evil.
What's the best alternative explanation to that?
The best that the secularists can say would be good is what brings the most happiness to the most people. But then, of course, you could never say, well, that society was evil because the society did what made them happy. Hitler did what made him happy and his society happy. But we would say, well, that was terrible what he did. That was evil. But you couldn't say that if that were your definition, if it's just what brings the most happiness to the most people. And it's arbitrary. What if I said good is what brings the most pain to the most people? In the secular view, happiness and pain are just chemical reactions in the brain. Why should I prefer that one over that one? The Bible gives us an objective basis for good and evil, and that's something that no non-Christian worldview can do.
Humans wear clothes, animals don't wear clothes. How did that come about? Why is that?
Well, that's tricky because a lot of people can just go back to like if you're Christian, Adam and Eve.
I do feel like, of course, it goes back to kind of the original sin, and the root of evil is one of the big things that came out of that was they felt naked.
Clothing is sort of like evolutionary.
I mean, a lot of animals have fur, so they have natural facilities to kind of keep themselves warm, so they never had to start wearing clothes.
Does the book of Genesis explain why humans are the only organism to wear clothes?
It does, because it gives us the history of how clothing came about. Originally it wasn't that way. Originally Adam and Eve were created naked and unashamed, but then because of sin entered the world through Adam's actions. He rebelled against God. They suddenly felt a profound sense of shame because they had done something they knew was wrong. And what God did is He then killed an animal or animals and provided skins of clothing for Adam and Eve. And that's just a beautiful picture of the way that God responds. We rebelled against Him, we commit high treason against Him, and He provides clothing for us to cover our shame. What an act of love. And of course, I think that also symbolizes the salvation that would come in Christ. God promised to send a Redeemer who would clothe us in His righteousness, and so that our shame would not be exposed for the world to see.
Why do you think humans naturally feel ashamed when they're not wearing clothes?
I think that's just because society creates those norms and that's what you grow up with, so that's what you automatically think. So that's how you feel if you're not following that.
Now imagine you were a secular anthropologist. What is the explanation for human clothing?
The best that I've heard from the secularists is that clothing was designed to protect us from the elements. But that doesn't account for the profound sense of shame that people would feel if their nakedness were exposed. Why is it that on a hot summer day people don't just run around naked? The secular worldview can't make sense of that.
Why do you think humans choose to work?
I know for me personally, like having that sense of accomplishment once you finish something that feels good. So I feel like that sense of accomplishment kind of gives us purpose. And so I think that's why people have jobs, to feel like they have a purpose.
Does Genesis have an explanation for why humans work?
We're made in God's image. God works, therefore we work.
Have you ever found work to be hard and laborious and sometimes feeling meaningless?
Oh, for sure. That's a fact of life, is not everything we do is going to be enjoyable.
Even good jobs have bad days. Why do you think that is the way it is?
I think it's hard if you don't have motivation, and that's a big part of it.
It's kind of just how we're hardwired, I guess, as human beings.
Does Genesis give any explanation for why work is so hard?
Yes, it does. It wasn't originally that way when the world was perfect, but because of Adam's sin, part of the punishment of that sin is that work will at times be unpleasant and difficult.
And what is the world's explanation for why work is so hard?
The modern secular world tends to follow in the path of the Greeks, who thought that man's problems were lack of education, and therefore the solution is education. You work smarter, work's not difficult.
Maybe you thought the book of Genesis was just a book filled with stories about animals on a big boat, or Joseph in his amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. But did you know it actually explains important realities like evil, clothing, and why work can be so difficult and exhausting? You might be thinking to yourself, that's it? That's not that impressive. Well, stick around.
There's something like 7,000 languages. Do you have any idea where that came from?
At some point, a language has to be developed in order to communicate. And it also makes sense that different communities that have no interaction with each other, it would actually be more surprising if they came up with the same language.
I guess languages comes from your different cultures.
I would guess that the first two people that were there, they communicated in their own way. I would guess body language, maybe grunts. I have no idea. But as certain groups of people emerged, they had their own communication.
What is the Genesis explanation for why there are so many languages?
It's actually a result of the curse that God placed on mankind when they built the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel was a tower whose top was dedicated to heaven, apparently to the worship of heavenly objects rather than the Creator. God disapproved of that. So he confused the languages. Certain people could understand each other, and that forms the basis for the different language groups that we see today. And since then, languages have diversified a little bit with time as well.
As people started to form their own groups, those languages kind of evolved into something that maybe other groups couldn't understand.
Can evolution explain why there are so many languages?
It's one of the perplexing mysteries in the evolutionary worldview. Certainly they would agree with us in terms of the way languages diversify with time over the past centuries. English has changed a little bit, we understand that. But in terms of why there are only a few dozen base language groups, that's something that's perplexing to the secularists.
Do you have a good explanation for why you think nations and nation states and borders, where do you think that comes from?
A long time ago, territories and whatnot were a big deal, and so I feel like it just kind of stems from that.
Humans naturally, they want things to be theirs, and so claiming land goes along with that.
I think us as a society are afraid of stuff that's new and different. You want to separate yourself from other people because they don't agree with everything you're agreeing with.
How does Genesis help us understand why we have nations and borders?
The Apostle Paul explained that in Acts 17. When he was explaining the Christian worldview, he went back and quoted from Genesis, and he went and talked about God the Creator and how God has apportioned people to fall under different nations, and God's in control of all that. So that all begins in Genesis.
Does evolution have a good explanation for that?
I think the best that they could do would be to say that people banded together to protect themselves. They found that they were stronger together. But that doesn't explain why we would do things that we would say are morally commendable but are against survival value. Protecting someone who can't contribute in return, who can't contribute to your survival. It doesn't explain why we would do that, why we would have morality in that sense.
The U.S. Census Bureau, there's something like 6 different categories of races that they put people into: white, black, Asian, Native American, Pacific Islander, or some kind of mixed. What's the best explanation for why there is the variety that we see?
Just geography, based on where you live.
Where they were kind of changed how they were.
I definitely look at the scientific viewpoint. Just our genetic makeups just makes us look different.
How does Genesis explain the reality of different ethnicities?
It actually goes back to the Tower of Babel as well. When God split up groups of people by confusing their languages, they were relatively small groups of people, and they had certain characteristics, certain sections of their DNA, some which were similar, some were different. So maybe some groups tended to have light skin, others tended to have dark skin, other groups were mixed. And they carry those traits with them, and the people that develop from those what are called founder populations tend to have the same traits as their ancestors. And so we have different ethnicities in the world as a result of the split that occurred at the Tower of Babel.
But calling them specific different races also kind of feels wrong. I don't think that's very human.
So what should we call them instead?
I mean, I think it just be people. I don't see why we should have different races to begin with.
What does evolution have to say about ethnicities?
Darwin had quite a bit to say about different, what he would call races. I would say there's only one race, the human race. But Darwin believed that different people had evolved by different amounts. He was well known as a racist, and he believed, for example, that the Caucasians, which of course he was, were the most evolved, and the Aborigines, he believed, were just barely above the apes. Really a very unbiblical and hateful view, a very racist view.
Where do you think the idea of something like justice comes from?
We do have that sense of good and evil.
So I can't really say where it stems from.
It came from defining what was good and what was bad and what's accepted by society.
The idea of justice stems from God repaying someone according to their actions. When somebody does something wrong and God punishes them, that punishment fits the crime. It's always appropriate. We don't see full justice on earth. We see partial justice. Certain crimes God has authorized the government to punish on his behalf. But full justice is not accomplished until Judgment Day, when God will punish everyone according to their deeds.
How does the Genesis explanation of justice match with the reality that we see in our world?
It makes sense of the fact that we have things like a justice system, that we have a government that is allowed to enforce certain laws but not others. The government, for example, can punish murder and should. You murder somebody, you should be arrested by the cops, you should be given a fair trial, and if there are eyewitnesses that confirm that yes, you're a murderer, you should receive the death penalty according to Scripture. But the government is not allowed to, for example, punish people for coveting. That's a sin of the mind. Only God is in a position to know that we've committed that kind of sin and therefore to punish us for it. So we see an example of justice in society, but it is only a foreshadowing of cosmic justice.
Who even knows, like if the whole world had restarted, our justice system could have gone totally different had we switched the definitions of good and bad.
Does evolution help us understand justice at all?
In the evolutionary worldview, how can you possibly know a person's motive when they do something wrong? Only God can know that. And so in the evolutionary worldview, there can never be perfect justice because you don't know the motivations of a person. A person who steals for food, that's a different level than someone who steals just because they want to have something that their neighbor has. There's a difference there. In fact, you really can't account for the existence of good and evil in a secular worldview because it's just different opinions on what people like and what people don't like. Absolute morality comes back to God, and therefore justice requires a biblical worldview.